In this episode, we're going to take a careful, beginner-friendly look at why legal and regulatory drivers matter so much in OT security, even when the day-to-day work feels like it should be about networks, devices, and keeping production stable. In industrial environments, cybersecurity is not only an internal preference or a nice-to-have improvement, because many organizations operate under laws, regulations, and contractual rules that define what must be protected and how incidents must be handled. Those external rules can feel frustrating if they are treated like paperwork, but they often exist because failures can harm people, disrupt essential services, or create broad economic and environmental consequences. At the same time, compliance pressure can push organizations toward rushed decisions if leadership becomes focused on passing an inspection rather than building real resilience. Our goal here is to understand how these forces shape OT security decisions, what kinds of obligations often show up, and what the real fallout looks like when organizations fail to meet expectations. By the end, you should be able to explain why compliance matters, how it influences behavior and budgets, and why the smartest approach is to treat compliance as a floor, not the finish line. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To make sense of legal and regulatory drivers, it helps to start with a basic idea that beginners sometimes miss. These rules are not all the same, and they do not all come from the same place. Laws are created by governments and can apply broadly, while regulations are rules written by agencies that carry legal weight within specific industries or regions. On top of that, there are standards and frameworks that may not be laws, but can become mandatory through contracts, insurance requirements, or industry expectations. In OT environments, it is common to face a mix of all of these at once, especially when an organization operates across multiple states or countries, serves regulated customers, or provides critical services. A single facility might have obligations related to safety, environmental protection, data handling, incident reporting, and supply chain assurance, and those obligations may touch cybersecurity even if they were not written primarily as cyber rules. Beginners should remember that when you hear compliance, you should ask compliant with what, for whom, and under what conditions, because different requirements can pull in different directions. Understanding the source of the requirement helps you understand how strict it is, how it is enforced, and what kind of evidence is expected. One reason compliance pressure becomes intense in OT is that regulators and the public care deeply about outcomes, not just intent. Industrial incidents can have consequences that spill beyond the organization, such as service outages, environmental release, or public safety risk, and that creates strong interest in prevention and accountability. In many industries, there is an assumption that operators should be able to demonstrate that they are managing risk responsibly, even when no incident has occurred. That is why regulations often emphasize governance, risk assessment, access control, change management, and incident response readiness, because these are the foundations that reduce the chance of catastrophic failures. Compliance pressure also rises after major incidents in an industry, because regulators update requirements and auditors become more skeptical. For beginners, it is important to see compliance as a form of societal risk management. It is the outside world asking an organization to prove it is not gambling with safety or essential services. This does not mean every rule is perfectly designed, but it explains why the pressure exists and why ignoring it can lead to consequences that go far beyond a technical inconvenience. When organizations face legal and regulatory obligations, they often experience two kinds of pressure at the same time: the pressure to build real capabilities and the pressure to produce evidence. Capabilities are the actual practices and controls, like strong access management, segmentation, monitoring, and recovery procedures. Evidence is what you can show to prove those practices exist and are being followed, like policies, logs, training records, change approvals, and test results. Beginners sometimes assume evidence is fake or purely bureaucratic, but in high-stakes environments, evidence matters because it creates accountability and allows someone outside the team to verify claims. The problem is that evidence can become the focus if leadership treats compliance like a performance for auditors rather than a discipline that protects operations. When that happens, teams might produce documents that look impressive while leaving real weaknesses unresolved. The healthy approach is to build capabilities first and then capture the evidence as a natural byproduct of doing the work properly. In OT security, the most persuasive evidence is the evidence that shows the organization can operate safely under stress, recover predictably, and manage changes without creating new hazards. A useful beginner lens is to think about what regulators and auditors are usually trying to prevent, because that reveals why certain controls keep appearing. They want to prevent uncontrolled access to critical systems, because unauthorized changes can lead to unsafe behavior or service disruption. They want to prevent unmanaged changes, because change is a common cause of outages and a common pathway for attackers. They want to ensure incident reporting happens, because hidden incidents can harm the public and prevent lessons from being learned across the industry. They want to ensure organizations have plans and the ability to recover, because resilience is part of protecting society's dependence on industrial services. They also want to ensure vendors and third parties do not become weak links, because modern OT depends heavily on suppliers and remote support. This is why legal and regulatory requirements often sound repetitive across industries, even when the exact wording differs. Beginners should learn that the goal is not to memorize every rule, but to recognize the themes, control access, manage change, maintain visibility, plan for incidents, and prove you can recover. These themes align closely with what good OT security would do anyway, which is why compliance can be a helpful forcing function when it is approached honestly. Now let's talk about non-compliance fallout, because the consequences are often broader than people expect. The most visible fallout can be fines and penalties, where regulators impose financial consequences for failing to meet requirements or for failing to report incidents appropriately. But the financial piece is only one part. Non-compliance can also lead to operational restrictions, such as being required to stop certain activities until controls are improved, or being placed under increased oversight that slows changes and increases administrative burden. It can lead to legal liability, where lawsuits and investigations arise after incidents, especially if harm occurred and the organization cannot show it acted responsibly. It can also lead to contract impacts, where customers terminate agreements, demand additional audits, or impose stricter security requirements that are costly to implement quickly. In some cases, non-compliance can affect licenses or permits, which can threaten the organization's ability to operate. Beginners should see that fallout is not only about punishment. It is also about loss of trust and increased friction that can reduce agility for years. When an organization becomes known as a compliance problem, everything from insurance to partnerships can become harder. Compliance pressure also influences behavior inside the organization, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in risky ways. A healthy influence is that compliance can justify investments in basic hygiene that might otherwise be postponed, like asset inventory, segmentation improvements, and incident response planning. It can also strengthen governance by forcing clear ownership and consistent processes across sites. But an unhealthy influence is the tendency to chase checkboxes, where teams focus on passing audits rather than reducing real risk. This can lead to controls that look good on paper but disrupt operations, creating resentment and workarounds. It can also lead to short-term fixes, like buying a tool to satisfy a requirement while failing to develop the processes needed to operate that tool effectively. In OT environments, rushed compliance projects can be especially dangerous because changes made without deep operational understanding can affect reliability and safety. Beginners should remember that compliance is not a substitute for thoughtful engineering, and the goal should be to meet requirements in a way that supports operations, not in a way that creates a new source of downtime. Incident reporting is an area where legal and regulatory drivers can be especially challenging for beginners to grasp, because it mixes technical uncertainty with legal deadlines. Many regimes require that certain kinds of incidents be reported within specific timeframes, even if the full details are not known yet. This creates pressure to detect incidents quickly and to have a process for deciding whether an event meets reporting criteria. In OT, detection can be complicated because systems may be older, visibility may be limited, and the symptoms of a cyber incident can resemble ordinary operational failures. A compliance-driven approach encourages building a clear incident triage process, including who makes the call on reporting, what information must be collected, and how to coordinate between operations, security, legal, and leadership. The risk of noncompliance here is not only failing to report, but also reporting incorrectly, which can create regulatory consequences and public confusion. Beginners should see that reporting requirements push organizations toward better detection and better communication, but only if the organization treats incident handling as a practiced routine rather than a last-minute scramble. Another legal and regulatory pressure point involves third parties, because industrial environments often rely on vendors for specialized equipment, updates, and remote support. Many regulations and contracts require organizations to manage third-party risk, which means understanding what vendors can access, what data vendors can see, and how vendor activities are controlled and monitored. If a vendor has weak practices and that weakness leads to an incident, the operating organization may still face consequences because it is responsible for protecting its environment. This is a hard truth for beginners, because it feels unfair to be judged for someone else's mistake, but in regulated environments, responsibility often follows control and ownership, not intent. That is why governance and contracting become part of cybersecurity in OT. Clear requirements for access control, logging, change approval, and incident notification can reduce supply chain exposure and improve accountability. The beginner takeaway is that legal and regulatory drivers often expand the scope of security beyond the facility's walls, because modern operations depend on relationships, and those relationships create risk pathways. Compliance also has a close relationship with evidence that holds up, and this is where many organizations struggle. Evidence needs to show not only that policies exist, but that they are followed consistently. For example, it is easy to write a policy that says changes must be approved, but harder to show that approvals are actually happening and that emergency changes are reviewed afterward. It is easy to claim access is restricted, but harder to show that access is regularly reviewed and that unused accounts are removed. In OT, evidence should also reflect operational reality, meaning it should show that controls were implemented in a way that did not create hazards and that systems were tested appropriately. Beginners should learn that evidence is strongest when it is tied to routine operations, such as change tickets, maintenance records, and monitoring logs, because those artifacts reflect what really happens. When evidence is created only for audits, it often becomes fragile and inconsistent, and auditors can sense that. Treating compliance as part of day-to-day discipline makes audits less stressful and makes security more stable. A final beginner misunderstanding to correct is the idea that compliance equals safety or compliance equals security. Compliance is important, but it usually defines minimum expectations, and attackers do not stop at minimum expectations. A fully compliant environment can still be compromised, and a compliant policy can still be bypassed if culture and operations are not aligned. This is why experienced OT security teams treat compliance as a baseline and then build additional controls and practices based on real risk. The right mindset is that compliance tells you what you must do, while risk management tells you what you should do next. When these two work together, compliance pressure can become a positive force that keeps basic hygiene from being neglected, while risk management drives continuous improvement and resilience. For beginners, this is an empowering idea because it means compliance is not a ceiling that limits creativity. It is a foundation that frees teams to focus on higher value improvements once the basics are in place. As we wrap up, navigating legal and regulatory drivers in OT security means understanding why external requirements exist, how they create compliance pressure, and what happens when organizations fail to meet expectations. Laws, regulations, contracts, and standards all shape what must be protected and what evidence must exist to prove responsible operation. The fallout from noncompliance can include fines, legal liability, operational restrictions, loss of customer trust, and increased scrutiny that makes everything harder. Compliance pressure can drive valuable investments and discipline, but it can also tempt organizations into checkbox thinking and rush changes that harm reliability. The healthiest approach is to build real capabilities that protect operations and safety, and to let evidence emerge naturally from discipline processes, so compliance becomes a reflection of maturity rather than a performance. If you can explain compliance as a baseline that supports safer operations, and you can describe how noncompliance creates cascading consequences beyond money, you will be able to reason about OT security decisions in the way regulated industries require.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.